silk, gunpowder, cold tea, and a maid whose eyes recorded the exit points of every skull in the room. The Korean mafia boss was supposed to collect on a massive gambling debt. Millions of dollars in markers were ready to be signed away. Instead, Darrell Rowland's eyes found the silent woman pouring jasmine tea in the corner. The one his rival kept poisoned and subservient, and everything changed. One sentence, 4 words, she pays the debt. What Julian Vane thought was a profitable trade became the spark of a global revolution. Because the maid he surrendered as a pawn is actually the Black Swan, a lethal shadow operative with a ticking clock in her veins. She has 7 days before the toxin in her blood turns her into a ghost, for real. Welcome, my dark hearts and shadow seekers. If you've been riding with me, you know we don't do simple damsels in distress. We do the Iron King of Soul meets the world's most dangerous assassin, hiding behind a white apron. We do the kind of chemistry that burns hotter than a muzzle flash. You're about to witness a collision between a woman with no time left and a man who just made the most calculated gamble of his life. He thinks he bought a servant. He has no idea he just brought a revolution into his penthouse. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm responding to everyone. Click subscribe. Like this video. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want me to miss them. Now let's begin. The blacked-out windows of the Maybach offered no view of Seoul, but Dorothy didn't need eyes to map the city. She counted the turns, the gear shifts, and the subtle incline of the road as they ascended toward the affluent heights of Gangnam. Beside her, Darrell Rowland sat in a silence so heavy it felt structural. He didn't look at her like a prize or a piece of meat. He sat with the stillness of a man who had just invited a hurricane into his living room and was simply waiting for the first gust. As the car pulled into the private subterranean garage of the Rowland Heights, the first wave hit her. It started as a faint hum in her bone marrow, a tectonic shift of her internal chemistry that signaled the toxin was beginning to feast. Dorothy clenched her jaw, forcing her hands to lie flat against her black uniform skirt. If she could just stay still, she could lie to her own nervous system. "We're here," Rowland said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to cut through her rising nausea. They ascended in a private elevator that required a retinal scan and a secondary biometric thumbprint. Dorothy's eyes didn't linger on Rowland. Instead, they flicked to the ceiling corners. High-definition wide-angle lenses, recessed infrared sensors. The elevator used a proprietary magnetic leveling system, nearly impossible to jam from the inside. By the time the doors hissed open into the penthouse, she had already identified 3 ways to die in the foyer alone. The penthouse was a sprawling temple of glass, steel, and shadow. It was beautiful, expensive, and a perfect cage. Rowland stepped out, shedding his suit jacket to reveal the holster strapped to his broad shoulders. "This is your floor," he said, gesturing to the panoramic view of the city lights. "My office is off-limits. The kitchen is stocked. There are no locks on your bedroom door, Dorothy. I find them redundant when the windows are reinforced with polycarbonate layering." Dorothy moved into the center of the room, her footsteps silent on the polished marble. She was already cataloging the security grid, laser tripwires at the balcony entrance, a localized dampening field that would kill any unauthorized radio frequencies, and a guard rotation she could hear through the floorboards. Suddenly, her left hand betrayed her. A violent, jagged tremor shot from her wrist to her elbow, the dead man's switch, demanding its tribute. She tucked the hand behind her back, digging her nails into her palm until she drew blood, using the sharp pain to ground her racing heart. Rowland turned, his dark eyes narrowing as they caught the slight tension in her shoulder. For a heartbeat, Dorothy thought about lunging, about ending him before the toxin ended her. But the Iron King simply watched her, his expression unreadable. "Get some rest, Black Swan," he murmured, using the name that was supposed to be a ghost secret. "The tremors only get worse if you fight the inevitable." He walked away, leaving her alone in the golden light of her new prison, a lethal weapon vibrating with the frequency of her own destruction. Dinner was served on a slab of obsidian that masqueraded as a dining table, set against a floor-to-ceiling view of the Seoul skyline. Dorothy moved with practiced, invisible efficiency, her steps muffled by the heavy silence of the penthouse. She placed a porcelain bowl of Haemul Tang in front of Darrell Rowland, her movements fluid despite the fire beginning to lick at the marrow of her bones. The toxin was moving faster now, a low-grade fever humming under her skin, making every blink feel like a shutter clicking in a dark room. Rowland didn't touch his spoon. He sat back, the ambient light of the city catching the sharp, predatory lines of his jaw. "The soup is excellent, Dorothy," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "But the performance is starting to bore me." He reached into the waistband of his trousers and pulled out a sleek, matte black Heckler & Koch. With a deliberate metallic clack, he placed it on the obsidian surface between them. The barrel pointed toward the empty space to his right, but the weight of the weapon shifted the entire energy of the room. "Pour the wine," he commanded. Dorothy stepped forward, the bottle of vintage Bordeaux steady in her right hand, while her left stayed tucked firmly into the small of her back, vibrating with a jagged, uncontrollable tremor. As the dark red liquid hit the crystal, Roland reached out, his fingers wrapping around her left wrist with the speed of a striking viper. He yanked her arm forward, exposing the violent shaking for the world to see. "The Black Swan isn't supposed to have a nervous tick," Roland murmured, his grip like a steel cuff. "I didn't pay 40 million in bad markers for a girl who can flip an omelet. I paid for the operative who dismantled the Moscow cell in a single night." Dorothy didn't flinch. She leaned in, her face inches from his, the mask of the submissive maid dropping to reveal the cold, dead eyes of a career killer. The tremors didn't stop, but the fear was non-existent. "If you know who I am, then you know how many ways I can kill you with that spoon before you can reach that HK." Roland let out a short, dark laugh, releasing her wrist. He didn't look threatened, he looked energized. "That's the woman I bought. Vane thinks he broke you with his little chemical leash, but a blade is still a blade, even if the hilt is cracked." He pushed the gun toward her. "Stop playing maid, Dorothy. You're dying, and the only person in this hemisphere who can get you into Vane's vault is sitting across from you. Eat. We have a war to plan." The fever didn't just burn, it vibrated. By 3 in the morning, the penthouse had transformed into a hall of mirrors, the city lights outside blurring into jagged streaks of neon static. Dorothy lay on the floor of her gilded bedroom. The bed was too soft, too much of a trap, pressing her cheek against the cold, uncaring marble. Her skin was slick with a cold sweat that smelled faintly of chemicals, a sign that the toxin was beginning to dissolve the very bonds of her cellular integrity. Her left arm was no longer hers. It thrashed in rhythmic, violent spasms that knocked against the floorboards like a dying fish. The door didn't creak when it opened. Darrell Roland didn't do anything as sloppy as making noise. He appeared in the doorway, a silhouette of absolute authority against the dim light of the hallway. He watched her for a moment, not with pity, but with the clinical observation of a man assessing a high-performance engine on the verge of total failure. "The internal clock is accelerating," he said, his voice cutting through the fog of her agony. He walked toward her, kneeling on one padded knee. In his hand was a small, pressurized injector, the kind used by elite combat medics. Dorothy tried to recoil, her hand instinctively clawing for a weapon that wasn't there. "Where did you get that?" she rasped, her throat feeling like it had been lined with crushed glass. "Vane's courier had an unfortunate accident on the Han River Bridge 2 hours ago," Roland replied. He didn't wait for her permission. He grabbed her trembling arm, his grip a grounding force in the middle of her personal earthquake, and pressed the injector against her neck. A hiss of pneumatic air followed, and a cold, numbing sensation flooded her jugular. Within seconds, the jagged tremors smoothed out into a dull ache. The static in her vision cleared. She stayed on the floor, breathing hard, looking up at the man who had just extended her life by a few measly days. "You stole a stabilizer. He'll know it was you." "Let him know," Roland said, standing up and looking down at her. "But don't get comfortable, Black Swan. That's a temporary patch, not a cure. The stabilizer only buys you 72 hours before the toxin becomes resistant to the formula." He walked to the window, his reflection ghosting over the skyline. "Vane keeps the permanent serum in a subterranean vault, a biosecure black box that requires 2 simultaneous biometric overrides, one at the terminal and one inside the cooling chamber. I can get us through the front door, but I can't be in 2 places at once." Dorothy pushed herself up, her movements still sluggish but no longer broken. She understood the play now. He hadn't bought her to be his maid, or even his assassin. He had bought her because she was the only person alive, with enough spite to survive the heist he was planning. "A 2-man job," she whispered, wiping the sweat from her brow. "A suicide mission," Roland corrected, a dark, lethal smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But then again, you're already dead. Might as well make it count." The basement of the industrial warehouse smelled of ozone, copper, and old sweat. It was a concrete cathedral for the desperate, a place where the soul underworld came to watch men break each other for sport. Darrell Roland didn't sit in the VIP booth. He stood at the edge of the shadows, his silhouette a sharp intrusion against the flickering fluorescent lights. "The stabilizer has stopped the tremors," Roland said, his voice barely a whisper against the roar of the crowd. "But I need to know if it's restored the edge. A weapon that looks sharp but shatters on impact is useless to me." He nodded toward the ring, where a mountain of a man, a disgraced heavyweight enforcer with scars like topographical maps, was wiping blood from his knuckles. "Go. No weapons, no mercy. Just the Black Swan." Dorothy stepped over the ropes, her black maid's uniform a jarring contrast to the grime of the cage. The crowd went silent for a heartbeat before erupting into mocking laughter. Her opponent grinned. a jagged display of gold teeth and arrogance, as he lunged forward. Dorothy didn't move until the last possible microsecond. As the man's fist whistled past her ear, she felt the familiar hum of her training take over. She wasn't thinking, she was calculating. The toxin had left her lean, but the stabilizer had turned her nerves into live wires. She pivoted on her heel, her elbow connecting with the man's solar plexus, with the force of a hydraulic press. The air left him in a sickening wheeze. She didn't stop. She was a blur of lethal geometry, a shadow that struck and vanished before the eye could track the movement. A palm strike to the chin, a sweep of the lead leg, and a driving knee to the ribs. Each move was a sentence in a language of violence she had mastered long ago. When the enforcer finally hit the canvas, unconscious before his head even touched the concrete, Dorothy didn't look at the cheering crowd. She looked at Roland. He wasn't leering. There was no possessive spark in his eyes, no hunger for a beautiful object. He was watching her with the cold, analytical intensity of a general reviewing his finest piece of artillery. He was measuring her recovery time, her weight distribution, and her strike accuracy. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. He hadn't bought her to serve his needs. He had recruited her to survive his war. "Your reaction time is off by 3 milliseconds on the counter-strike," Roland remarked as she stepped out of the ring, his hand reaching out not to touch her skin, but to hand her a towel. "But the lethality remains intact. You aren't a servant, Dorothy. You're an army of one. And tomorrow, we start the invasion." The smell of antiseptic and ozone always triggered the same phantom pain in Dorothy's neck. Long before the silk and mahogany of the penthouse, there was the white-tiled silence of the Swan program's facility. She remembered being 12 years old, strapped to a stainless steel chair, her eyes taped open as a digital strobe burned tactical data into her retinas. They hadn't just taught her how to kill, they had dismantled her soul and rebuilt it into a flowchart of cause and effect. Emotion is a friction point, the instructors had hissed, injecting the first prototype of the toxin into her young veins. Become the ghost, or become the ash. Every meal was earned through a kill, every night of sleep purchased with a successful infiltration. She had been forged in a vacuum of empathy, conditioned to believe she was nothing more than a high-precision tool with an expiration date. The sharp click of a tablet being placed on a glass table snapped her back to the present. The white tiles vanished, replaced by the warm, dim lighting of Darrell Roland's private study. "You're drifting, Dorothy," Roland said, his voice grounding her like a physical weight. He didn't look up from the holographic display. The Swan program didn't leave a paper trail, but they left a pattern. And Julian Vane is the one holding the pen. He swiped his hand, and a dossier expanded in the air between them, a spiderweb of shell companies, illegal biolabs, and security rotas. Dorothy's eyes sharpened, the instinctual mapping of a predator taking over. This wasn't just a list of names. It was a blueprint of Vane's soul. Roland had found the cracks Dorothy had been too close to see. He pointed to a specific node in the network, a private storage facility in the Incheon docks. "Vane's arrogance is his greatest vulnerability," Roland explained. "He believes that because he owns the cure, he owns the weapon. He's diverted 60% of his security budget to protect his digital assets, leaving his physical supply chain exposed to someone who knows how to move through the blind spots. Someone like you." Dorothy looked at the file, then at Roland. In the Swan program, files were assignments, targets to be erased. But Roland was offering her something different. He wasn't giving her an order. He was giving her the intelligence required to make a choice. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't looking at a master's demands, but a partner's strategy. "He thinks I'm still the broken girl in the white chair," she whispered, her fingers hovering over the image of Vane's fortress. "Let him keep thinking that," Roland replied, his dark eyes meeting hers with a spark of shared defiance. "The ghost protocol only works because they never see the spirit coming back to claim the body." The crash of the crystal carafe against the marble floor was the only warning. Then came the sound of Dorothy's body hitting the ground, not with the practiced grace of an assassin, but with the heavy, limp finality of a machine whose gears had finally ground to a halt. The seizure was a violent electric storm that tore through her muscles, arching her back until her spine threatened to snap. The temporary stabilizer had reached its limit, and the toxin was reclaiming its territory with a vengeance. Her vision fractured into jagged shards of white light, and for the first time in her life, the Black Swan was truly, terrifyingly helpless. She expected the cold click of a gun, the final mercy of a clean kill before she became a liability. Instead, she felt the warmth of a heavy wool coat being draped over her thrashing limbs. Broad, steady hands moved her away from the sharp edges of the shattered glass. "Easy, Dorothy. Breathe through the static," Roland's voice commanded. It wasn't the voice of a master. It was the low, steady rumble of a man who had stood in the center of a different kind of storm. As the tremors subsided into a dull, agonizing ache, Dorothy lay gasping, her head resting against the base of Roland's desk. Her dignity felt as shattered as the crystal. She looked up, expecting to see disgust on his face, but found only a grim shared understanding. Roland sat on the floor beside her, his expensive shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He reached up and pulled back the fabric at his shoulder, revealing a gnarled, puckered mess of scar tissue that looked like it had been carved by a jagged blade and cauterized with a blowtorch. 3 years ago I was left for dead in a shipping container in Busan, he said, his eyes fixed on the distant city lights. My own brothers sold me out for a seat at the table. I spent 4 days bleeding out in the dark, listening to the waves, waiting for my heart to stop. I wasn't the Iron King then. I was just a man dying in his own filth. He looked down at her, his expression raw. Vane thinks he owns you because he gave you a cage and a clock. My family thought they owned me because we shared the same blood. They were both wrong. Dorothy reached out, her fingers still trembling as she touched the edge of the silk rug. The silence between them shifted from tactical to personal. He wasn't just keeping her alive for a heist. He was recognizing the ghost in her because he was haunted by his own. We aren't weapons, Dorothy, he murmured, his hand hovering just inches from hers, offering a connection she didn't know how to take. We are survivors, and tomorrow, we stop surviving and start winning. The Incheon industrial sector was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and salt-crusted concrete, a perfect shroud for Julian Vane's most guarded secret. Rain lashed against the facility's corrugated steel roof, providing a rhythmic mask for the two shadows moving through the perimeter fence. Dorothy felt the stabilizer holding, but the edges of her vision were beginning to fray. She had exactly 2 hours before the chemical patch failed, and her body became its own executioner. Sensors are live, Roland whispered into his comms, crouched behind a stack of industrial crates. He looked less like a mafia boss and more like a tactical reaper, a suppressed rifle held with practiced ease. The internal grid is slaved to a kinetic movement processor. If it detects a threat profile, someone with a tactical gate or a weapon, it locks down the vault. But it doesn't look for the help. Dorothy nodded, shedding her heavy tactical cloak to reveal the simple, starched white apron and black dress she had worn for 3 years. She looked small, fragile, and utterly inconsequential. To a computer programmed to identify assassins, she was background noise. She tucked a single glass cutter and a localized scrambler into her pocket. Once I'm at the cooling chamber, the primary alarms will trigger. You'll have approximately 90 seconds of invisibility before they realize the Maid is the breach. I'll give you 3 minutes, Roland promised, his dark eyes locking onto hers. No one gets past the lobby while I'm breathing. Go. Dorothy stepped out into the open, her posture slumping, her gaze dropping to the floor. She moved with the shuffling, invisible gait of a woman who spent her life scrubbing floors. She walked directly past the infrared scanners, her heart rate controlled, her mind a cold vacuum. The laser grid swept over her, but the AI interpreted her slow, rhythmic movements as non-threatening maintenance. She passed the first security checkpoint, then the second, as guards laughed over coffee, barely glancing at the woman who had ostensibly come to empty their trash. The moment she reached the reinforced titanium door of the lab, the play changed. Dorothy straightened, her eyes snapping into predatory focus. She slapped the scrambler against the keypad and used the glass cutter to bypass the biometric plate. Inside, the lab hummed with the sound of cryogenic vats. As she stepped toward the central cooling unit, the floor sensors registered her weight shift, now precise and aggressive. A klaxon began to wail, a shrill, piercing scream that signaled the end of the ghost. Outside, the heavy, rhythmic thud of Roland's rifle began to speak. The lobby erupted in a chorus of gunfire and breaking glass. Through her earpiece, Dorothy heard the chaos, the shouting of Vane's security teams, and the steady, unwavering return fire from the man who was holding the line for her. Roland wasn't just providing cover. He was a one-man war, drawing every guard in the facility toward the front entrance, clearing a path for her soul to survive. I'm in, Dorothy hissed, her fingers flying across the lab terminal as she fought the first tremor in her hand. Take your time, Black Swan, Roland's voice came through, punctuated by the metallic clack of a fresh magazine. The door is staying shut. Secure the serum. Dorothy ignored the shouting in the hallways and the bullets thudding into the laboratory's reinforced glass. She watched the digital readout on the cooling chamber crawl toward completion. Behind her, the heavy doors began to buckle under a battering ram. She was a woman caught between 2 deaths, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't fighting alone. The air in the extraction bay was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic tang of spent brass. Dorothy stood by the central cooling console, her fingers white-knuckled around the translucent vial of permanent serum she had just retrieved. Her body was a map of agony. The toxin was beginning to fray the last of her motor controls, and every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. Across the debris-strewn laboratory, Daryl Roland was pinned behind a fallen server rack, his ammunition spent, his shoulder leaking a dark, persistent crimson. Standing between them, flanked by a phalanx of tactical guards with red laser dots dancing across Roland's chest, was Julian Vane. Vane looked immaculate, a stark contrast to the carnage around him. He held a secondary vial, the catalyst needed to activate the serum, between his thumb and forefinger. He looked at Dorothy not as a human being, but as a runaway piece of property he was prepared to reclaim or destroy. "Look at you, Dorothy," Vane sneered, his voice amplified by the lab's acoustics. "Trembling. Breaking. All for a man who bought you like a common trinket. Did you really think the Iron King cared about your soul? He wanted a skeleton key to my vault, and you gave it to him." Vane held up the catalyst, the blue liquid shimmering under the emergency lights. "The serum in your hand is inert water without this. You have 60 seconds before your nervous system begins its final collapse. I'll give you the cure. I'll even give you your life. All you have to do is prove your loyalty remains where it belongs." He gestured toward Roland. "Kill him, Black Swan. Put a bullet in the man who used you, and come home." One of the guards tossed a loaded handgun at Dorothy's feet. It clattered against the tile, a heavy, tempting weight. Dorothy looked at the gun, then at Roland. Roland didn't plead. He didn't ask her to save him or tell her it was okay to choose her life. He simply watched her with those dark, unwavering eyes. The eyes of a man who had sat on a cold floor with her and shared the weight of his own scars. In that silence, Dorothy realized that for the first time in her existence, she wasn't being measured by her utility. She was being seen. Vane's home was a white-tiled room and a chemical leash. Roland's prison was a place where she had been allowed to be angry, to be lethal, and to be human. "Tick-tock, Dorothy?" Vane prompted, a smug smile tugging at his lips. "Choose." Dorothy reached down and gripped the handgun. The tremors in her hand vanished, silenced by a sudden, glacial clarity of purpose. She leveled the weapon, her aim true even as her vision blurred at the edges. "You're right about one thing, Julian," Dorothy rasped, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "I was a weapon, but a weapon doesn't belong to the person who built it. It belongs to the person who knows how to hold it." She didn't pivot toward Roland. She fired 3 shots in a tight, blindingly fast cluster. The first 2 took out the guards flanking Vane. The third shattered the glass catalyst in Vane's hand, the blue liquid spraying across his expensive suit. Before Vane could even scream, Dorothy lunged. She moved like a shadow through the chaos, her body ignoring the toxin's protest for one final, explosive burst of violence. She tackled Vane to the ground, her fingers locking around his throat, while her other hand snatched the master injector from his inner pocket. The emergency override he always kept for himself. She jammed the needle into her own neck, slamming the plunger home. A roar of fire surged through her veins, followed by a sudden, cooling silence. The tremors stopped. The fog lifted. The Black Swan was no longer a dying ghost. She was a predator at the peak of her power. She looked down at Vane, whose face was turning a mottled purple beneath her grip. "I'm not coming home, Julian," she whispered, her eyes burning with a terrifying light. "I'm already there." She didn't kill him, not yet. She stood up, leaving him gasping for air, and walked through the smoke toward Roland. She reached out her hand, not to pour his tea or check his perimeter, but to pull him to his feet. Roland took her hand, his grip firm and grounding. He looked at the vial she had secured, and then back at her, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his exhaustion. "I told you," he murmured, "a suicide mission." "Next time," Dorothy replied, her voice filled with a newfound steel. "Let's pick something a little more challenging." Together, they turned away from the ruins of her past, walking out of the laboratory as equals, leaving the Master of Shadows to rot in the dark. The penthouse was different now. The floor-to-ceiling glass no longer felt like the walls of a terrarium, and the silence that draped over the sleek, minimalist furniture had lost its predatory edge. The toxin was gone, replaced by the steady, quiet hum of a body finally at peace with itself. Dorothy stood on the balcony, the crisp soul wind whipping her dark hair across her face, watching the city below wake up in a mosaic of neon and gray. For the first time in 3 years, the map in her head wasn't a series of exit points and kill zones. It was just a city. She heard the heavy, rhythmic tread of Daryl Rowland behind her. He didn't sneak, and he didn't loom. He simply existed in the space beside her, leaning his forearms against the railing. He had traded his tactical gear for a charcoal silk shirt, though the bandage beneath it still pulled at his shoulder. He looked out at the horizon for a long time before he spoke. "The jet is fueled and waiting at Incheon," he said, his voice a low vibration in the morning air. "There's a flight plan logged for Zurich, with a secondary connection to the Cayman Islands. New identities, clean accounts, and a medical detail to monitor your recovery. Everything you need to disappear so deeply that even the ghosts of the Swan program won't be able to find you. Dorothy turned to look at him, her eyes searching his for the hidden catch, the fine print, the secondary debt. And the price? There is no price, Dorothy, Roland replied, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were tired, but they held a clarity she hadn't seen before. The debt Vane held was a lie. The debt you think you owe me for the serum is a shadow. I didn't buy a slave, and I didn't recruit a soldier. I made a gamble on a woman I respected. You've won your freedom. You don't owe me a single second of your life. He reached into his pocket and placed a small, encrypted drive on the railing between them. That's the kill switch for the last of Vane's tracking data. Once you leave this balcony, you belong to no one. You're free to go. Dorothy looked at the drive, then at the man who had stood in the line of fire for a broken maid. She thought about the white-tiled rooms of her childhood, the cold tea of her servitude, and the way her hands used to shake. Then she thought about the way Roland had sat on the floor with her during her seizure, not as a master looking at a failing tool, but as a survivor looking at a mirror. She didn't pick up the drive. Instead, she stepped closer, the space between them closing until the cold wind couldn't pass through. "You're an idiot, Daryl Roland," she murmured, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, the first real one he had ever seen. "You spent $40 million and risked a war with Vane just to give me a plane ticket." Roland's jaw tightened. "I did what was necessary." "No," Dorothy corrected, reaching out to place her hand over his on the railing. Her grip was steady, warm, and intentional. "You did what was right. And in my world, that's much rarer than a serum or $1 billion port deal." She looked out at the city, then back at him. "You said you couldn't be in two places at once during the heist. You said you needed a partner." "I did," he admitted. "Then keep the plane," Dorothy said, her voice turning to steel. "I've spent my whole life being sent places by men who wanted to use me. For the first time, I'm choosing where I stand. I don't want a new identity in Zurich. I want to see what the Iron King and the Black Swan can do to this city when they aren't fighting for their lives." Roland's hand turned beneath hers, his fingers lacing through hers, locking them together. It wasn't a shackle, it was a bridge. "It won't be a quiet life, Dorothy. Vane was only the beginning. There will be others who want to sand down our edges. Let them try," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder, her eyes fixed on the rising sun. "They'll find out the same thing Vane did. You don't own a revolution. You join it." The past was a pile of ash in an Incheon lab. The future was a blank map, and for the first time, Dorothy Chan wasn't a weapon being aimed. She was the hand on the trigger, and she was home. Thanks for watching. Please like, comments, and subscribe.